Thank y'all for joining me today here at Grace Point for Bible study. We are in the middle of, we're toward the end of our series in Ecclesiastes that we've entitled Reality Check. And this is next to last week on this book. And so hopefully you've been encouraged by it, challenged by it. And so today we're going to talk about growing up and growing old. And so I'm no longer growing up, but I definitely am growing old. And so we want to spend our time talking about that and working on growing in our relationship with God. One of the signs, or many of the signs that you're growing old, I saw these the other day, and I thought they were pretty funny, is that your back goes out more than you do. Your arms are too short to read a book. You enjoy hearing about other people's operations. And this is probably for men. Your back is getting hairier than your head. It takes twice as long to look as good, half as good as you used to, and things like that. Those are all the things that happen to us as we grow old. And Solomon's going to talk about that today as we walk through most of Ecclesiastes 12. So here's where we're going. We're going to do the first half of Ecclesiastes a little over, and then we'll look at the end. Then next week I want to do one section of chapter 12 and talk about teaching and communicating the scriptures with those around us. So let's dive into Ecclesiastes 12. Thank you so much for joining us today. And this is Solomon writing in chapter 12, verse 1. He says, "Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come, and the years draw near of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them." Now, this is a word to young people. So if you got some young people in the house, you might want to go gather them around. Or after this is over, you may want to show them some of this to encourage them to remember God while they're young. And for them to mark this in their mind. It's not a time to forget about God when you're young. It's actually a time to keep in mind who God is, and He is your Creator. You to remember who He is, because He's the one who made you and gave you your life. And so one of the things I encourage young people to think about is don't put off living for Jesus while you're young. Actually, make that a point in your life to live for Jesus while you're young, to use your energy, use your strength, and use your talents for Him while you're young. Don't put it off and say, I'll do that later. When you're young, at least for me, and I think it's true for you, when you're young, you think, hey, I'm going to live forever. Time it seems to move so slow. I remember being in school as a youngster and looking at the clock, and it seemed like those hands were barely moving. It's like, how long is this class? And so when you're young, you seem like you've got forever, but the reality of it is time moves really fast. And as you get older in age, you discover like the days seem shorter. They're actually the same amount of time. It's just the way that you experience time is much different as you get older. I think just due to the busyness of life and always having a calendar in front of you and working from one thing to the next. And so I think what Solomon is saying to young people is follow Jesus while you're young. Follow God while you're young. You will not regret living for God all out while you're young. I've not been a perfect person, but I can say that the majority of my life, since I was saved when I was 7 years old, and God began to work in my heart and mind all the way until now, the majority of my life I've been either in church or in ministry or serving in some capacity. Well, when I was younger, that was obviously not on staff, but for the majority of my life and all of my adulthood, I have been on staff at the church and singing and serving in some capacity. And so I trusted God when I was 7. About 12 or 13, I felt like God was, impressing upon me to take a vocational call to be a pastor. And then as I look back over my life, my testimony is really that I have served the Lord. And I got to say to you, look, I don't have any regrets about what God has been doing in my life for all these years. I'm really thankful when I look back. I didn't have this, time in my life where I was just living for fun and sowing a wild oats sort of life. I look back at my life and I'm thankful that even in my youth, I was able to serve God and to minister to others. And so I want to say that to you is like, don't wait until you get older, but actually do it while you're young. And this is what he says, like look at your life. And he says, serve God in those good days, because the bad days are coming. The days that will come when you say, I find no pleasure in them. Now, I wouldn't say in my age right now that I'm to the point where I say I find no pleasure in them, but I see those coming, and I know that life has gotten harder as I've gotten older on my body. And so these days he's talking about are when you get, and this is what he's going to describe poetically in a minute, is that he's talking about those days that are evil. They don't measure up to the days like they were when you were young. And you'll say, these days it's hard to find pleasure. And so use these days that you have as a young person to honor God. There's so many people in Scripture that when they were young, they lived their life for God. And I would say if you sat down with them in heaven and you said, what would you change about your life? Would you have just sought after more fun and partying, or would you actually just, wish you to live more for God? And I think they would say more for God. I think people like David, when he was a shepherd boy, living for God. I think about Joseph, when he was a young man, not complaining, even though he's in difficult circumstances. Daniel, when he was a young man. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they lived for God. And I think that they would have no regrets. And there are days that are going to come where you can't do what you used to do. Many of us are experiencing that now. We could give a testimony. I can't do what I used to be able to do. I can't run as fast. I can't jump as high. I don't look as good as I used to. And so we have these struggles. And so, as a dad, and as an older man now, I begin to look in the mirror and I have a dad bod, and I'm like, I hope that gets back in style, but it's probably not in style. And, and I'm sure ladies have some of the same struggles. And so if you're young, here's the word for you. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Use your life while you're a young person for the glory of God. That's what you were created for. That's what God has sent Jesus to save you for, so that you could live to make him look good. I remember in high school, I played football. And we were traveling from Macon to Augusta, Georgia for a game. And I remember sitting next to a guy on my team. I'd known him since we were young kids, and we had played together in Little League football and some other things. And we're sitting on the bus, and we're driving to this game. And God impressed upon me to share my faith with him, to tell him about Jesus Christ. And so I began to lean into that and really giving him the invitation of Jesus and challenging him to live his life for Jesus. And I remember vividly what he told me on that bus ride. He said that he wasn't quite ready to do that, that the idea of following Jesus sounds really good. The idea of being saved sounds really good. But here's what he said. He said, I really want to spend my high school years just doing what I want to do and having fun. In other words, almost if you can't have fun following Jesus. I would argue that you can have fun following Jesus, but here's the point. So he just said, hey, I'll do that later. I'll do that when I get older, like young people would say, like when I get 30, that's older. And all of us older than that, we go, that's really young. And so he says, hey, when I get older, then I'll, turn my life over to God and I'll follow him. Well, after that moment, and we graduated from high school, it was 20 years later, and I was at my 20th high school reunion, and I remember seeing him. And guess what? He still was not following Christ. And so, saying you're going to, hey, I'm going to live for myself and my fun while you're young, and then eventually, all of a sudden, I'm going to change and start following God. Number one, there's no guarantee that you're going to do that. Number two is, why waste those years of your life when you're most likely single, so you can be in a single devotion toward Jesus, when you have a lot more energy, when you have a lot more, time, and you may not have the financial resources, but you have the bodily resources to ministry. Why would you not want to use that for the glory of God? And so here's a word to parents. And so I want to speak to you. So speaking to young people, look, live your life while you're young for the glory of God. Don't waste that precious time. And now to parents, look, one of the things that you need to impress upon your kids is that they understand this. Remember God in the days of your youth. Help them to understand that the days when they're young is a great time to serve the Lord. Impress upon them that while they're young, that they can make a difference in people's lives. So thankful for my parents, because one of the things that they did is they introduced the gospel to me. They took me to church, and so at my house and at the church, we're combining to impress my life. And so I discovered, even at the early age of 7 or 8, that I could make a difference in somebody's life. My great-grandfather, not my great-grandfather, my step-grandfather, actually came to Christ because something I did back when we were going to Sunday school. I made him a card, and I basically wrote out the gospel on it, gave it to him, and that was a catalyst for him to come to Christ. And it was at that moment, at a very young age, I began to realize God can use me to change somebody's eternity. And so when you can help your kids understand the difference they can make, there's no telling what God can do through their teenage years and even through their childhood, that they can make a difference in somebody's life. They can change their direction. They can ultimately change their eternal destination. So I want to encourage you to invest in your youngins and help them and prod them along toward God, that they would remember God in their youth. And so Solomon, after he says that, he says, this is what's going to happen. So he gives his poetic description of person as they go through old age and they get old, and so the aging process is described. It's a really interesting section of Scripture. And here's what he says in verse 2. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return after the rain. Verse 3, in the day that the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men are bent, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those who look through the windows are dim, and the doors of the street are shut, and when the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. They are afraid also of what is high. Terrors are in the way. The almond tree blossoms, and the grasshopper drags itself along, and the desire fails. Because man is going to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. And so, as you look at verse 2, what you see described is the aging process. As we get older, what happens to our bodies? And the truth is, when you're young, you can't wait to grow older. What did you say when you were a kid? Man, I can't wait till I grow up. And then all of us who've gotten older are looking back, oh, man, I wish I was young again. I wish I had that body of that 18-year-old. I wish I could go back and do this. And I wish, I looked like this. And so, when you're young, you want to get older. When you're older, you wish you were young again. And that's the kind of the nature of life. The best way to live your life, whether you're young or whether you're old, is to live all out for God, no matter what season you're in. If you were to look at your life as seasons, obviously, springtime would be birth and new things. Then you'd hit a summer, and then life hits fall. And then as you get into older age, you get into winter. And so what he describes here is before the sun, the light, and the moon, the stars are darkened, means that there is a dimming going on. As you live your life and you get older, life will slow down. It'll get darker. The clouds will build. And he's talking about this process of moving and getting older. It's as if the sun comes up, and then at the end of the day, it is getting dimmer. And then in verse 3, he describes, first of all, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble. The housekeepers tremble. What are the housekeepers? Those are the ones who provided and protected the house. And so these are the arms and hands of a person. And what he's describing is as a man who begins to tremble with his hands. And if you've been around elderly people, you may have seen this as they've grown older. Maybe you've seen their hands shake. And I remember as a little boy seeing old people, and I would see their hand tremble. And it reminds me when I read this that these are the protectors of the house, the housekeeper. And now those hands that used to be so powerful and used to be so steady are now trembling. And so he has now shaky hands. And then he begins to describe this man and these older people like this, and the strong men are bent. And so you've seen as people get older, they have a tendency to stoop over. You've all seen the picture of the old person with the cane, and they're bent over and they're stooped over. And this is what he's getting at, is because as we get older and our bodies begin to break down. For men, Proverbs 20:29, I believe, says that the glory of a young man is his strength. Well, what happens when his back is getting weaker? He begins to stoop and bend over. And that is often first displayed in the hunching over with the shoulders. And so the place it used to be, the guy had his shoulders up and he's the broadest man, and now he's all of a sudden not able to carry the own weight of his body. And so you start stooping over and you lose the strength in your shoulders. And then the next section in verse 3 is this: is the grinders cease because they are few. This is your mouth. This is actually your teeth falling out. And so when you come across the term molar, it comes from the Latin term that means millstone. And millstones were what were used to grind things. And so what are your molars? Your molars are the teeth in your mouth that allow you to grind up your food. That way you can digest it. Your the incisors, your teeth, the sharp teeth up front, are for tearing into something, and then you grind it down. And so what he says is the grinders cease. And so it's the old person who is losing their teeth, and they're not able to, chew like they used to. They have a periodontal disease, where their gums and their bone begin to break down and they begin to lose their teeth. And so, as you get older, you discover that this is part of what happens as you get older. And if you lose all your teeth, then the grinders cease. And so then you're resorting to, gumming your food, and you're resorting to moving toward a soft diet. And so maybe your diet moves from, hey, I'm eating meat and Doritos, to down to soup and pudding and grits and things like that. And so, that's some of the things that we all, see happen as we get older. I remember growing up, and my grandmother would take out her false teeth, and, it would freak me out. And they would be laying on the side of her bed when I would see her. And so it was just that's what's happening when you get older. That's that aging process. And so he describes then, and those who look through the windows are dimmed. And so he begins to, he described the teeth. Now he's describing the eyes, and he says the windows grow dim. Windows are metaphors for the eyes. And so the windows get harder to see out of as you get older. And so, I find that I go to the eye doctor a lot more now at this age than I used to when I was younger. And what I've discovered that over time, my eyesight is getting worse, and I see things dimly. I wear contacts. If I take my contacts out and I were to look at the microphone in front of me, I would say, man, it would be totally blurry. It would be a lot dimmer than it used to be when I was younger. So what happens as you age, your eyes grow dimmer. You don't see as good. Your eye pressure becomes a problem. You got cataracts, and you end up with contacts or glasses. And so the eyes truly do dim with age. I was reading about this, and it says, for one thing, pupils, the round black holes that let light stream into the eyeball, as you get older, they get smaller. And so therefore, you are starting to deal with, older eyes that don't see as well. Matter of fact, Genesis chapter 27 is a story of Jacob and Esau seeking the blessing of their father Isaac. And his eyes, it says in verse 1 of chapter 27, his eyes had grown dim. And so what happened was Jacob knew his dad couldn't see as well as he used to. So when he went in and he tricked him, he put on, because Esau was real hairy and he was smooth, he put on a fur coat, and he went in and he tricked his dad. And his dad said, well, you feel like Esau, you sound like Esau, but there's something not quite right. But he couldn't see him well enough because his eyes had grown dim. And so he gave the blessing to Jacob, and Jacob basically stole the blessing from his brother Esau. And so, it's interesting as you read this that one of the things that happens as your windows grow dim, I think an underlying part of that is not only does your eyesight go bad as you get older, your cognitive abilities begin to decrease as well. It's very common for all of us as we get older to struggle with our thinking processes. And so, it's those things like memory loss and like, where did I put my keys? I can't remember where I did with this. And, I can't remember that, or you have trouble thinking through things. And so the aging process is rough. It's part of the whole dying of the body, and part of the curse on us is that we are in this aging process. And Paul writes to the Corinthians that, look, when we follow Christ and we become a new creation, man, we're getting new on the inside. So actually, we're getting better on the inside, but on the outside, old body's breaking down. The old body can't do what it used to do. The old body doesn't look like it used to. You're dealing with wrinkles and all these things that you wish you didn't have. I mean, where's the smooth skin? I had a girl that used to be in my youth group, and her husband that I did a wedding for, and so they were having their 10th anniversary recently, and they asked me to send a video of myself, to them, just wishing them a happy anniversary and stuff. He had asked me to do this since I did the wedding, so I sent it to him. And when I first did the video, I looked at it, and I was like, whoa. I was like, who is the old man? I was like, the old man is me. And I'm looking at all the wrinkles and the gray. And so it's just the breaking down of body as you walk through this. And this is what Solomon's describing. Listen to this. He says, the doors on the street are shut when the sound of the grinding is low. In other words, the doors on the street are your lips. And so as you, like my grandmother, when she didn't have her false teeth in, this is a reference to her mouth, and so the doors are shut. In other words, when a person loses their teeth, their lips begin to sink in, and so the opening is shut, and the sound of grinding fades because once you lose your teeth, those grinders, you can't munch and crunch on your food. Eating Doritos is not what you're doing because it hurts your gums too much, and so you have to move to that soft diet. And so, I remember laughing so hard years ago when I was watching an old Saturday Night Live skit. This is all the way back, probably 80s, and they had this was back when Chevy Chase was on there. They had a restaurant filled with old people, and the restaurant was called Pre-Chew Charlie's. And so they had a guy, and it was pretty gross, but it was funny. He would come over to your plate, and he would cut up your meat, and it's called Pre-Chew Charlie's because he would pre-chew your food before you ate it so that the older people could swallow it. I know that sounds disgusting, but that's what I actually thought of when I read this passage, because that's what begins to happen as we age. And so he goes on to describe this aging process, and he says, one rises up at the sound of a bird. Now all the daughters of the song are brought low. In other words, so you get up because you hear the birds singing, or at least you get up early in the morning when the birds are singing. And the point is, but at some point, as you age, you can't even hear the birds singing. So the problem you have is you can't sleep as long as you used to, and you don't sleep as well as you used to. And the problem is your hearing's going bad, so you get up with the birds in the morning, but you can't hear them when you get up. And so that is a part of that aging process. And he says, the chirping that you used to hear in the early morning, even though you're up early in the morning, you don't get to hear it like you used to. And I know for me that, I used to be able to, when I was younger, sleep like really late. I mean, like a teenager late. But today, I find myself getting up earlier and earlier. And those moments when you know that you can sleep later, but you can't go to sleep. And it's so frustrating. And so this is what he is describing. As you get older, this is what goes on in your life. And you can't hear those birds because you lose the ability to hear high-pitched sounds. I remember we used to have here at Grace Point an older gentleman who would sit, especially on Wednesday night Bible study like this, he would sit off to my left when I was teaching. And he would sit with his wife, and his wife would often nudge him and on the side because he had hearing aids. And if you ever been around somebody with hearing aids, you know that sometimes their hearing aid will start this whistling sound, and you can hear the whistling sound, but it's like right in their ear, but they can't hear it. And so she would punch him and go, "Get your hearing aid," and so he would fix his hearing aid. And so this is the kind of thing that Solomon has put in this passage to describe what it's like when you get older. And then he says, these are the days, not evil in terms of moral things, but evil days, and that these are days that you and I have, we don't have the pleasure in them that we once used to have when we were young. And he's saying, this is where you're going in life. Everybody starts on the journey. They're born and they start growing up, and their bodies are getting stronger and stronger and stronger. But there gets a point when everything begins to change. We see this play out all the time in sports world. You got guys who they start playing in the little league, and then they go through middle school and high school, and they're superstars, and they're getting better and better, faster, stronger, jump higher. And so eventually what happens is they hit their 20s and they begin to hit a peak. And as they get to the peak, they begin to hit that downward slope. So you get to the peak of what you are probably physically, and then what Solomon is describing is what most athletes go through. They hit the peak, and then there's this decline, and then it starts going down steeper and steeper. It's why, like, if you are in the NFL and you start getting in your 30s, you're often seen as, old and worn out because the body can't do what it used to do. That's what's amazing about somebody like Tom Brady or some of these guys who play into their 40s, because they are still physically capable of doing that. And I'm sure that they praise God for that. I hope they do. They should, because once you get to a certain age and you hit that peak, it starts going downhill. And so this is what is described by Solomon as the aging process. And he helps us to see this. And so moving on through verse 5, he says there, as you get older, they are afraid also of what is high, and terrors are in the way. And so he describes there are two things that older people get afraid of as they age. One is high places. Why? Because what happens as you get older, your stability and your agility begins to weaken, and you're not as strong as you used to be. And so there's this fear of falling. Because we've gone to do Tough Mudders and we hike a lot, I can tell you that the things that I used to do, and maybe the jumping from one place to another over things, I'm a lot more hesitant to do it than I used to be. You probably are too. One, because I don't do it a lot, but the other problem is I have a bad knee, and so for me to take that step is a little bit frightening. And so as you get older, you get afraid of high places because you're afraid that you'll fall off. You get afraid of the way, the dangerous streets, because back when you're younger, you look down the street and I'm good, I can go handle myself. But as you get older, you're not as fast, you're not as strong, you're not as quick to react, and so there's a fear about you. And so it's why, typically, when I was growing up at the church that I went to, we had a morning service and we had an evening service, and the pastor was always really trying to be aware of what time it was, because he wanted to get the older people out before it really got dark so they could get home before dark, because a lot of them were afraid to go out in the streets in the dark. And so it's important that we all recognize that as we get older, we're going to face new fears. And so you have to work through those. He says the almond tree blossoms. In Palestine, the almond tree blossomed in midwinter, not the spring. And so the winter season represents old age. And so white flowers come in the season of winter, in midwinter. And what does that represent? That represents white hair. So what happens is you get older, you get gray hair. Is anybody that hiding gray hair? Maybe it's you. You're hiding your gray hair. And so, it's ladies who go, they start dyeing their hair because they don't want anybody to see their grays. Or maybe it's us bros that we start getting our Just for Men. Now, I just decided, as you can tell with my gray beard, that I'm good with the beard, because I'm hoping that the gray hair, like Solomon says in Proverbs, is a sign of wisdom. And so I'm dedicated myself not to get the Just for Men, but this is what he's talking about. The almond tree blossoms, and so you have these white flowers. As you get older, you begin to gray up. And then he says, the grasshopper drags itself along. In other words, the grasshopper used to be quick, but as he gets older and he gets toward the end of his life, what happens is he's not as quick as you used to be, and so it's easier for him to get caught. Anybody ever catch grasshoppers when you were a kid? Try to catch them. Man, those young ones are really fast, and you got to be quick to snatch them. And so when they get older and they get fat, they have a hard time walking. Look, that's what happens to us. That's why we always have these cartoon pictures of these old people with walkers and canes. Matter of fact, we went hiking last week, and I have a walking stick that I take with me. And one of my friends saw the picture on social media, and he sent it to me, and he made a comment about asking me why I was having a cane with me. And I told him, I had that walking stick, but, I'm trying to look for a staff so I can be like Moses. And I said, this is what old men do. They have walking sticks. And so, because we're like the grasshopper who drags himself along. I see this even with our dog at home. Our dog Hershey has gotten older. We've had him. I forgot how old he is, but he's getting the almond blossoms. He's starting to gray up in his little beard, and he's put on weight as he's gotten older. And so one of the things that we've noticed about him, especially over even the last few months, is where he used to be spry and jumping all over the place. We watched a video the other day, and we saw him in, and he was just jumping up and down like a grasshopper. Now, because of his age and because of his weight, we have to pick him up and put him on the couch. He used to just jump up there. Now, every once in a while, he gets real excited. He's still able to do that. But he is going through the same thing we are going through, because just as we are subjected to the fall and our bodies are dying, so is creation is going through the same experience. And so this is what Solomon describes. He even goes into this. He says, listen, he says, the grasshopper drags itself along and the desire fails. And what he's talking about is your appetites and your passions begin to diminish. Even a person, as they get older, begins to lose their appetite to eat. You may even get to the point where your libido begins to die down. Your sense of smell and taste begin to change as you age. They said that between 40 and 50 years old, your taste buds decrease. You begin losing some of those things that you used to enjoy. At the age of 60, you may be even to the point where you lose the ability to distinguish between what's sweet, what's salty, and what's bitter. And so some of you may be going through that as you get up in age. And there's a strong reference to this really being towards sexual desire. The literal translation of that phrase is the capyberry is ineffective. And the capyberry was a natural aphrodisiac that was used in Palestine at the time. And think about it like this. This is the ancient, Viagra and Cialis, and so if they would have had, Israel commercials, they would have a capyberry, and that's what they would have been promoting rather than Viagra or Cialis. And so you had this berry instead of the, blue pill. And so this is what is beginning to wane as you get older. You don't have testosterone like you used to have it if you're a guy, and you begin to struggle with the loss of some of your physical appetites. Also, he goes on to describe, because man is going to his eternal home. And then he says the mourners go about the street. So as you start from birth and you move through those young years and you hit your peak, and then you begin to go through midlife and you get up in age, what you're moving toward is a natural progression of heading toward your own passing away, going toward your eternal home. And so in all of our futures, unless Jesus returns and takes us home, we are facing a funeral, our own funeral, and our own grave. And then the people who love us, who have been here with us, who are still alive, will mourn in the streets. They will mourn our deaths just like we will mourn some of the people that we now live with. And so life continues. And so this is what, Solomon is describing. And so in verses 6 and 7, he says, before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern. What he's saying is, look, as you go through this, you're going to experience life, you're going to experience death. He even goes to say, and the dust returns to earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanity, says the preacher. So in other words, remember God, all throughout your life. Live for his glory. Have fun, but remember God. And then he says, because you are going to go through this process of life, you're going to age, and then you're going to die. And he says, look, the silver cord is snapped, the golden bowl is broken, the pitcher is shattered, the fountain, the wheel is broken. These are things that wear out and break. And he says, so it is true with our bodies. The silver cord is severed because it holds the golden bowl, and it's broken, it falls, and it shatters. The same with the clay pitcher that is worn out, it gets dropped, it gets broken. The wooden wheel that used to be used is just worn out, and so you have to replace it. Dust returns to the ground. In other words, so there's going to be in all of our lives, we were created from the dust by God. He took you out from the dirt. He blew life into you. You know, for us, obviously, we're born from our mother's womb, but the reality of it is that Adam came from the dust, and he blew life into him, air into his lungs, and he began to live. And then his body is going back to the grave, dust to dust, and then where his spirit is going to go. The spirit is going to go to be with God because God created him. Now, he's going to go be with God if he has placed his faith in God. And so old age and the aging process is frustrating. As you get older, and as long as you're moving toward your peak when you're young, it's all good. You just know you're going to get stronger. You're going to, your body's going to get better. But at some point, you start realizing, and this is where a lot of people go through midlife crisis. You begin to look at life and go, I'm not what I used to be. And so you begin to try to turn that around. But the problem is old age is frustrating. The aging process is frustrating. And so one of the things that I want to challenge all of us as we get older, whether we're 12 or 13, or whether we're 32, or whether we're 65, or whether we're 79, that while we're here on earth and while we're in this body, that we would maximize what God has given us, our bodies, for his glory. That's why we're here. So in other words, if you are still alive on earth, no matter what your age, God has a plan for your life. God wants to use your life to make a difference in somebody else's life. And so you don't want to miss that. Now I'm going to skip this section starting at verse 9. I want to go down to the end. This is the summation of the whole book, but it's also the summation of this chapter. This is the conclusion. Here's what he says. The end of the matter. All has been heard. Everything's been said. This is what it comes down to, because we like to get to the bottom line. So Solomon says, let's get to the bottom line. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, every secret thing, whether good or evil. And so here's what he says. This is the conclusion. Fear God. Fear your Creator, because he uses God's name that is used in creation. He says, you need to fear the Creator because of who he is. He's created you. He made you. And so you need to have reverence for who he is. Think about what God has done. God created all that is by speaking it into existence. So it's no thing for God to create something out of nothing. No one does that but God. Everything that you and I make, everything that people make here on earth, they take something and they make something else. But God just speaks it into existence. So what he says is, you should fear God. In other words, you should put your faith in God. You should trust God because he is powerful. Because he is who he is, you should fear him. And does it have like the idea of reverence? Yes. Does it have the idea that he's a little bit scary? Yes, because he is. I mean, no one is like God. And think about this. If angels dwell in his presence and they are fearful of him, and then every time you see an angel in the Bible show up, everybody hits the deck, what do you think it would be like to be in God's presence? You will fear him. Even though he's good and he's kind, he's God. And so he says, first thing, fear God. How do you know you fear God? You keep his commandments. In other words, fear God and keep his commandments. That in the New Testament would be live by faith, and it will be evidence in your words. It would be like Jesus says, trust and you would obey. And so those things go together. So if I fear God and I know who he is, then what I'll do is I'll do what he tells me to do, because that's how you should live your life. If he is the creator, he created me by speaking me into being, by placing me here on earth, then he knows what's best for my life. And so my duty is to do what he says. And so this is who he is. This is what he says. This is what's best for my life. And so my duty is to do that. That's the requirement of my life. And so I trust him. I know who you are, and so I obey you. And so why would you do that? Because in verse 14 he says, for God will bring everything that you do into account. In other words, God is going to hold you accountable for all that you do here on earth. Even us as believers, we will be held accountable before God for what we do. Our rewards will be based on what we do. So Solomon is saying this. He's saying, look, you're young, remember God. You're old, and you're going to go through this aging process, remember God. And then he's saying, but when you die, and they have a funeral for you, and your body's in the grave, it's not over. There's a judgment. There's accountability. So don't think just when they put you in the grave, it's over. It's not over. That there's more life to come. And that you will live somewhere, either in heaven with God or hell, separated from God, somewhere. So you'll die physically, but spiritually you'll be alive, and there'll be a resurrection. And the resurrection, you will get a new body, and that body will sustain you through eternity. And so, as Solomon writes, he says, for God's going to bring everything that you do into account. He's going to hold you accountable for what you do. He says, even the secret things, even the things that nobody else knows that you've done, he knows what you've done, because God's omniscient. He sees everything you do. So like if you get into a dark place and you say, I'm going to go do this and I'm going to do that, nobody will ever know. God knows. And God will hold you accountable for that. So whatever you do in private, whatever you do in public, God knows everything that goes on. And so we all will stand and give an account for what we have done. Now, the good news of the gospel is we are not going to be separated from God forever based on what we've done if we've placed our faith in Jesus Christ. And so we get declared righteous by the works and things that Jesus has done. And so that's the good news of the gospel. So if you're counting on your deeds before God to get you past judgment, then you in a bad spot. But if you place your faith in Jesus Christ, then you have hope, and you are safe within the hands of the Father, because he sees you through Jesus. And so that judgment will only be the judgment and separation from those who are lost and those who are saved. And then that judgment that we all face as believers will be just based on our rewards that we get in heaven. And so what he says is, look, God's going to bring everything into judgment, even secret things, whether they're good or evil, whether they glorify God or they didn't glorify God. And the whole of what Solomon is writing is to say to us, look, I want to take you on this journey, and I want to take you by pleasure. I want to take you by intellectualism. I want to take you into materialism. And I want to take you through these things, and I want to show you why you're so frustrated with life. And he says at the end of this is there's the bottom line that comes out to all of this. This is the reality check moment. That all that really is going to matter at the end of the day, whether you're young or you're old, is your relationship with God. And what he says is, you need to fear God. You need to have worship of God and reverence for God. And how do you do that? You just do what he says. And why would you want to do what he says? Because in doing what he says, you demonstrate that you trust him. And it's through that trust you're saved. Because what the Old Testament says and the New Testament echoes through Jesus is, the righteous shall live by faith. It's not that you're righteous by what you do. You're righteous by who you believe in. And so he says, the bottom line comes to this. Put your faith in God. Fear him. And trust him by doing what he says. And that is the command. And so, where are you today? Are you a young person and you're listening and you're thinking, I don't know about this whole thing of following Jesus? I want to encourage you. you will never regret living your life for the glory of God and the good of others. You won't look back at your life and go, I wish I would have not done good to people. I wish I would have not served people. I wish I wouldn't have forgiven people. And as you age, if you're an older person, you look, your life's not over. God still has a plan for your life. It can be much harder, and maybe, maybe you're incapable of doing some of the things you used to do. But whatever God's got for you, he can still use your life. It's amazing stories all throughout the Bible of people that he used their life even when they were 80 years old, like Moses. Abraham had a child when he was 100. God uses your life if you're willing just to come to him and say, I fear you and I want to do your will, then God can use your life. And it's the best life possible. Are you frustrated with life? Turn to Jesus. That is the hope for killing frustration in your life. I will turn to Jesus, I will follow him, and I'll trust him with my life. Therefore, I can trust him in my death, that I might live forever. That's our hope. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for tonight, and just an incredible knowledge that we gain as we look at your word, and we look at when we're young, how we should live. We see as we move through middle life how we should live. We see how we should live when we get up in age. That you have us here on this planet for your purposes. Let us remember who you are and let us follow what you've said to do. It's really that simple. If we want the best life possible, it's simply by knowing you and serving you. And so, Father, move our hearts in that direction. And Father, when we have fallen short, we can fall upon the grace that you have given us in Jesus Christ, so that we know that we are forgiven and that there's a future grace for our lives, no matter what we've done. So thank you for this, Jesus. All praise and glory to you. In your name we pray. Amen. Thank you for joining me tonight. We'll see you online later this week. Have a blessed evening.